Welcome, everybody. My name is Sidney Nestle, and I'm on the Adult Education Committee of Congregation Darchei Noam here in Toronto. Most of you are from Darchei Noam, but some of you aren't, so welcome. I'm pleased to introduce tonight's speaker on the topic of Zionism, was it ancient myth or modern revolution?
Ancient dream,
sorry. Ancient dream or modern revolution. Our speaker is Professor Joshua Shanes of the Jewish Studies Department of the University of Charleston, also the director of the Arnold Center for Israel Studies at the College of Charleston at the University College of Charleston. Professor Shanes has published widely on modern Jewish politics and culture and religion, as well as anti-Semitism and contemporary politics, both in academia and in popular outlets such as Slate, The Washington Post, Haaretz, and The Forward. Professor Shanes, as I understand it, grew up in Chicago, where he's talking from tonight. He lived in Israel for 3 years in his youth, more or less, I guess. He grew up in the conservative movement, but he spent many years as a Chabad, with Chabad, and now he identifies, as he said, as stum observant, just observant. And but I do understand that he's a very good Torah laner and much sought after in various congregations around Chicago and Charleston. So with that, I'll turn it over to Professor Shanes.
Thank you so much. I appreciate it. And I appreciate you all coming out here. I still have this sort of imposter syndrome. I'm shocked that anybody besides my parents are here. So it's really quite amazing. I am going to share my screen because I have a PowerPoint to show you. So I'm going to do that now. If I can figure this out, share screen. And here we go. And it's at the slideshow. Let's see, slideshow from beginning. I think everyone should be able to see the screen now. Thank you. Thank you all for coming. It should be an interesting, I hope, a fun night. If nothing else, in about 25 slides, I have some sketches of Theodore Herzl with no clothes on. So if nothing else, we get to see some Herzl in the buff.
Josh, I'm going to interrupt one thing I forgot to mention. So Professor Shanes is going to speak for 40, 45, 50 minutes, we'll see, and there'll be questions and answers afterwards. If you have questions, please type them in the chat, and myself and Marianne will sort of help sift through them and read them to Professor Shanes at the end. So
excellent.
Sorry, continue.
Yeah, no, thank you. And please don't hesitate to start typing them in as they occur to you, because you're going to forget. So if you have a question as we go, please type it in, and Sydney, I guess we'll gather them together at the end. By the way, I haven't rehearsed this at all. I have zero idea how long it could take. It could be 35 minutes. It could be an hour and 45 minutes. I really don't know. So I guess give me a heads up when we're getting close to wrap up time, and I'll make it work. Okay. Here's my objective for the evening. First, I'm going to give you just a little background about how I came to this topic that I'm going to be speaking about tonight, which is a topic that I talk a lot about in teaching and on social media and in popular publications, which is the notion of how Zionism functions as a kind of form of Jewishness, a kind of religious denomination, even though it maybe doesn't have a structure like a union or something like that, but that it's constructed to think about it that way. So what I'd like to do is first give you a sense of how I got there, a little background on my sort of scholarly trajectory. Then I'm going to spend a while taking you through the history of early Zionism, what it was and how it relates to that moment in history. And then we'll come back at the end to understand how Zionism interacts with sort of other forms of modern Jewishness. So that's sort of the trajectory that we're going to have. And somewhere mixed in there, I have some nude sketches of Herzl. So my first book, which was my dissertation before that, was about diaspora nationalism. I was very interested in the idea that scholars sort of talked about Zionism as being this weird nationalism, because other nationalisms were localized wherever they lived, and the Zionists were interested in some sort of faraway state. That was the thought that if you read the Zionist idea, the famous Hertzberg reader about Zionism, he talks about it that way. And people talk, the way Ben-Gurion and others talked about Americans, they're not real Zionists, because real Zionists, are focused on moving to Israel or something like that. And what I found, what I wanted to study, because it didn't, and as I dug into it, I realized I was much more right than I realized, was the extent to which Zionists, from the beginning, were not especially interested in going to Palestine, which is what they called it back then. It wasn't a political term yet. They were not interested in going to Palestine, the land of Israel. They were actually interested in the same project that American Zionists are interested in, which was Jewish diaspora politics, Jewish ethnic identity, a way of expressing, of being Jewish and advancing local Jewish interests. So I studied Galicia, which is Austria, Austrian Poland. They were interested in language rights and proportional representation in the parliament, all sorts of sort of budgetary issues for Jews living in Austria. And they were trying to advance the idea that Jews constituted a nation. What I argued was that what the Zionists were doing was and this was actually one of the points of the Basel program, the famous Basel program from 1897, when Zionism was first formed by Herzl, was to create what's called in German National Selbstbewusstsein. It means national self-consciousness, national self-awareness, to get Jews to think about themselves, thinking of themselves as a nation. That was a very hard sell. It took them years, decades actually, to convince Jews to think of themselves as constituting a nation. They were resisted by everybody, as we'll see. And what I realized was this is the same thing that everybody else is doing in Eastern Europe, right? Poles, Ukrainians, Lithuanians, Romanians, all these other secular nationalists were screaming at their potential constituents to try to forge them into a nation. And I wanted to show how Jews were doing the same thing, which I think I did successfully. So this is where I'm coming from, say, 15 or 20 years ago. But over time, I was thinking about more and more, what does that mean exactly to create national consciousness? What does that mean to create national identity? And I'm increasingly being exposed to artifacts and people and ideas and texts that suggest something far deeper than just national identity. I'll tell you a story. This is a Maisa Shahaya, as they say in Yiddish, a true story that I was sitting on a plane in 2001. I was very much a Chabad Chassid. And the moment the plane took off and the seatbelt fasten seatbelt sign came off, being that it was very close to Shabbos, I was the only religious person on the plane. And being that I was a Chabad Chassid, I picked up my tefillin bag and I asked every single person on the plane, every single man on the plane, forgive me, if they would please put on tefillin. That's what a Chabad Chassid is, and I was deep into the Kool-Aid. After I did that for a while, I sat down next to the guy next to me, and I remember his name. I can't remember his last name, but he was an Olet to Israel, and he had 2 kids. And in my memory, I don't think I'm making this up, his kids' names were like Ben Sion and Sabrina from Sabra, right? I mean, this was a verbrennte, chassid of Zionism, right? Like old school, like he's going to Israel and they're dancing the hora every night and, and singing mime. It's something like this. And he said to me, why don't you move to Israel? And I said, well, I have no friends or family there. I have no career there. I have no money. I don't especially like it there. I have no cultural contact. I'd have to give up my entire career, which I've trained for 7 years for. I was just about to graduate with my PhD. And I'm very close to my family and friends. And I gave him a whole list of reasons why I really didn't want to move to Israel. And he said to me, well, you're a hypocrite. You're a bad Jew. You're a bad Jew. You're a hypocrite. There's a clear mitzvah to move to Israel and you could do it and you're not doing it. I said, okay, I'm a bad Jew. I said, would you like to put on tefillin? And he said, no, thank you. And he went back to his movie. Now, I'm not judging him, obviously, certainly not from where I am right now, which is no longer of that world. But I thought to myself, you are calling me a bad Jew for not giving up my entire life and moving to Israel. And you have 12-hour flight to Chicago with nothing to do but some bad movies. It wasn't even a choice of movies back then. And you don't want to put on tefillin. Now, whether or not there's a mitzvah to move to Israel or not, I don't, the Rishonim debate this, but certainly it's hard to imagine that the mitzvah of putting on tefillin weighs less than the mitzvah of moving to Israel. And it certainly cost a lot less at 2 minutes of your 10-hour flight. And I realized it's because this is his Jewishness. For him, the key mitzvah, the only one really, is to move to Israel. And the other things are tofel. You have in a halachic terminology, what's called ikar and tofel. The main thing and the sort of the condiment that's not so important. That's the main thing for him, move to Israel. And then I started seeing this everywhere I look. So for example, I just got this year. You can buy now a scroll of the Declaration of Independence with trope. Sydney mentioned I'm a Balcora, I'm a laner, which I am. Here you can lane the Declaration of Independence with trope, right? This is a religious ritual going on here. This came up this morning and my Facebook page exploded with hundreds of comments. You have here a post by Yishai Fleischer, who's the spokesman for the Hebron community, where he's celebrating this guy shooting bolts at a Palestinian flag. And he's got a tattoo that he says, know before whom you are standing. A tattoo in Hebrew, know before whom you are standing. But this makes sense to me, right? Because I understand already, this is their Jewishness, right? The mitzvah of not having a tattoo, that's not so important. Other mitzvahs, social justice, maybe not so important, but settling the land and violently pushing back Palestinians, that's the key thing here. That's what God's about. The God is the God of the enemies of Israel, right? Know before whom are standing is what we think about when we go to prayer. It's about our own humility. Here, it's the fear of the enemies. Or most famously last year, when Natan Sharansky and Gil Troy published this article, the un-Jews. What does that mean, the un-Jews? People who are not Zionists, or not Zionists in the right way. They're heretics, right? Just like what used to be a category hundreds of years ago in Jewish law, a person who violates Sabbath publicly, Machalo Shabbos B'Ferhesia. That is someone who's outside the fold, right? You can't count them in a minyan, you can't marry them, etc. But now, what puts you outside is if you're not Zionist or not Zionist in the right way. So how did we get here? That's how I came to this point. So and the key transition to me is this guy, Robert Bellah, who wrote an article about 50 years ago that led to a whole field of academic study about civil religion. He didn't coin the term, it was Rousseau, but he popularized it, about civil religion. The idea is nationalism does the same thing that religion does. It tells you who your community is. It tells you how to read the past. It tells you what rituals you have to do. It tells you what days and places are holy. It gives you all of the aspects of religion that religion used to give you, but towards nationalism. And there's maybe more than one version. That was the intervention of his student, Robert Withnow. There could be multiple versions of it, but that's the idea. And I think that is what Zionism is doing. And that's what I'd like to try to demonstrate to you in the time that I have. Before modernity, Jews lived in autonomous communities. There was no nation state. There was no single class of people in any state. It was a corporate society. There were castes, serfs, noblemen, guilds members, priests, nobility, whoever, and Jews. And Jews had certain rights, they had certain privileges and obligations of what they could do and had to pay and so on. And there was no Jewish question. Everyone knew what a Jew was. It wasn't a national identity. It wasn't a religious identity. It was just who you were. You might have other identities too, but there was no question of what it meant to be a Jew. That's all going to change when nationalism comes. This new ideology that claims to be old, but is completely modern. And it's going to transform what it means to be Jewish. There's actually different types of nationalism. Scholars tend to distinguish between cultural, ethnic, organic nationalism, the idea that the nation is like a body, an organism, not something you could choose to be in or out, just who you are, versus a political nationalism or a civic nationalism, which is like a sort of a social contract. We all live here in this place, and therefore we're all part of this nation. It doesn't matter where we come from, and it doesn't matter, your skin color, things like that. Two possible notions of the nation. Now, when nationalism is first born, when the nation state is first born, it's coming out of France, right? France is widely considered to be the first modern nation state. There are no more subjects in France. There are only citizens. And that citizenship was defined but through a civic nationhood, right? Everyone who lives here, as long as you give up your corporate identity, that means Jews too within a couple of years. As long as you are citizens who happen to be Jewish, you are full and equal citizens. And the Jews in France and later other countries in Western Europe, especially Germany, embrace this Jewishness. And you have the birth of Judaism as a kind of religion, right? We are all German, French, English, whatever we are. We all share that. I mean, in Germany, for example, you have Reform and eventually conservative, what becomes conservative and different kinds of Orthodox Judaism. They all basically share this notion of belonging to the broader nation and Jewishness being a religious identity only. The problem comes when nationalism spreads to Eastern Europe, because it doesn't work the same way there. Check out this map that I happen to have handy right here. So here's a map of Europe in 1815, right? So here's France, England, the various German states, Austrian Empire, Russian Empire. When we look at it from the perspective of languages or ethno-linguistic groups, you immediately notice that in the West, they're roughly unified. Now, I know that there's scholarship that shows Southern French and Northern French are different dialects and so on. I'm oversimplifying slightly, but more or less, France is French, right? And even Germany, once it unifies, is German speaking of one kind or another, but not in the East. In the East, you have a hodgepodge of ethno-linguistic groups, and they're not in a state that identifies with any of them, right? They're part of broad multinational empires, which means when nationalism comes, it's not going to be defined by what state you're in, because it's clear that not everyone here is Russian. Almost nobody is Russian here. It's clear that not everyone here is Austrian. Actually, nobody is Austrian. There are no Austrians, but it's clear they're not all the same national group. So how do you know who exactly is of what nation once the idea of nationalism comes to those places, which is, of course, where most of the Jews are living? And the answer are things like language, religion, and economic caste. And wouldn't you know it, that Jews in that area have their own language, their own religion, separate from the non-Jews, and their own economic niche in most places. And so what you begin to develop is a kind of ethnic nationalism, which not only excludes Jews most of the time, not always, but most of the time, right? It's not about your patriotism to the cause, it's about your blood, as it were, but it also offers a definition of Jewishness that Jews could pick up on themselves. And that's exactly what happens with Zionism. Zionism is a modern, as we'll see in the next slides, a modern movement born in reaction to all of that. It is a word that represents a wide swath of ideas. It is a very heterogeneous movement. Political Zionists, led eventually by Herzl. Practical Zionists, people who just wanted to settle the land. Cultural Zionists, led by Ahad Ha'am, who I'm sure many of you know about, right? Who are not interested in the land or politics at all, but far more interested in a secular Hebrew language. Labor Zionists, Marxist Zionists, you have the right-wing Zionists, you have the binationalist Zionists, you have Messianic religious Zionists and non-Messianic religious Zionists and territorialists. You know, in Galicia, I study Galicia, so there were many different types of socialist labor Zionists. One of those groups was called Po'alei Zion, the Workers of Zion. Po'alei Zion later split between Po'alei Zion and left-wing Po'alei Zion, Linke Po'alei Zion. And then Linke Po'alei Zion later split between the Galicia Lincoln Po'alei Zion and the other Linke Po'alei Zion. And within Galicia, they eventually had like 6 different branches of the Linke Po'alei Zion, which is a branch of Po'alei Zion, which is a branch of the Labor Zionists, which is a branch of the Zionists. If you've seen Life of Brian, it's a little bit like the joke about the Judean People's Front and so on. It was amazing how many different divisions they had. But I think we can say, and I took this from a scholar named Gidon Shimoni, I think we can say there are 4 basic principles that all Zionists have, that all Zionists share. Number 1, Jews are a nation beyond religion. This is revolutionary. Your religion is not relevant. You know, Aleph Bet Yeshua personally came to my Hebrew class 25 years ago when I was in graduate school. And he said, you know what we need? We need more Christian Jews and Muslim Jews. And everyone sort of giggled. They had no idea what he meant, but I knew exactly what he meant. If we have Jewish Americans and Muslim Americans and Christian Americans, then we should have Jewish Jews and Christian Jews and Muslim Jews, because for him, being Jewish was a nationality, not a religion. That's where this comes from. It's a modern revolutionary idea. Number 2, the diaspora is defective. It's not working and it's not going to work. Number 3, the solution is going to be gathering together to some place, maybe Palestine, maybe not, right? Herzl famously was exploring other ideas too, and some continue to explore other ideas. There's many books on that that have come out recently. And finally, the means to accomplish this would be through self-help, meaning you're not going to wait for the Messiah, you're not going to wait for God, you're not going to wait for the Tsar or for the king or the prime minister. You're going to do it yourself. Now, some of this might have been only in theory. This might have been only an idea which you were using as a form of identity, as I began the lecture talking about. But this is in theory what Zionists wanted to accomplish. In other words, it is a reaction to emancipation. It is a post-emancipation idea. Jews in 19th century Europe were being emancipated left and right in Western Europe. And these Zionists were saying, no, that's not the future. Either because, as Pinsker and Theodore Herzl would say, it's not going to work, it's impossible. Or as Haaretz would say, no, it will work, but it's immoral because it's asking Jews to give up their nationality. It's asking Jews to give up their Hebrew secular language, right? So it's not okay. But it's a secular post-emancipation phenomenon. They are going to, as we'll see in a second, draw on the past, but it only emerges now for specific reasons. And not, by the way, primarily because of anti-Semitism. Because I got to tell you, the 19th century was probably the best century in Jewish history in 2,000 years. It was certainly a hell of a lot better than the 20th, and it was definitely a lot better than the previous ones. The 19th century was really good. It was safe, and Jews were getting freer and freer and freer. But that's when Zionism was born, because of these other trends going on. Now, here's the thing. These are secular ideologies. Why do I say they're secular? I'm going to argue against myself using the term secular in a moment, but for now, we're going to call them secular ideologies. Why secular? Well, first of all, they were almost all radically secular people. You know, kosher, Shabbat, right? Max Nordau, the second in command of the Zionist movement, married a non-Jew. Herzl gave him a mazel tov. Herzl had a Christmas tree. I mean, these people are not, these are radically secular people, right? Because that's not what Jewishness was for most of them. It was secular because it was about self-help. We're not going to wait for the Messiah. It was secular because the definition of the nation was bigger than the religion. But even beyond all of that, their Weltanschauung, their Hashkafa, their Hushkafa, it was different, right? They looked at the world through secular, untraditional eyes. It was not about the Jews' relationship with God. It was about the Jews' relationship with the rest of humanity. So, for example, for them, Hebrew was a national language. It was not a religious holy tongue. It was the national language. They wanted Hebrew because Hebrew united Jews across time and space, at least as a language of prayer and scholarship. It was a national tongue, not a holy tongue. Jewish collective identity was historically understood. There was no sense of being a chosen people by God. The land of Israel was an historic territory, right? It was not the holy land promised by God. It was the land that the ancient Israelites used to have sovereignty. Sorry about this. I gotta hide this somehow, but I'm not quite sure how to do it. Let's see here. Put it up there. The Bible. I can probably make this smaller too. Here we go. The Bible is proof of Jewish sovereignty. It's the deed to the land, not because God promised it, but because it demonstrates that ancient Jews used to live there and have sovereignty there. And rituals are relevant, but only if they're connected to this land relationship. And I'll speak about this some more in a bit. Why is it paused? There we go, wrong direction. So remember these guys, Robert Bellah, right? So if this is all secular, how is it supposed to appeal to people? Because one thing people tend not to want, especially traditional people, is something newfangled, right? If you have a new religion, you're often going to be much more successful if you have a claim to ancient authenticity. I'm thinking about, for example, the Mormons with the golden tablets, Kabbalah, right? The Zohar. Oh no, I didn't write the Zohar. It was, I had ancient manuscripts. It goes back to Shimon Bar Yochai and goes back from them to God. You want to have something more ancient. And nationalism, as a civil religion, as a form of religious identity, has to do the same thing. So Zionism is going to need building blocks to prove itself as an authentic form of Jewishness, the same as Reform and Conservative and Orthodox will, right? Why does Reform Judaism need Micah 6:8? What does God want of thee? Be a mensch. I forget the exact language. Be a good person and walk with God. I forget the verse, but you know what I'm talking about, right? Be a good person, right? Ethical monotheism. That's Reform needs that, because what's happened in the modern world, imagine you have a wonderful building block set and your 8-year-old made a magnificent palace out of it. But then the 4-year-old comes along and trashes it. That's modernity. It's been trashed. And then you say to the 8-year-old, all right, you got about 20 minutes here. I got a box that can hold half the blocks. Pick any blocks you want, build something new in the box, and we got to go. That's modernity, right? So all of these Jews are picking blocks, and they're real blocks. They are symbols and texts and traditions and historical incidents and artifacts. They're real, but they're all choosing different ones and then putting them together themselves and saying, oh, well, this is basically the same thing. It's the same palace. But they've all chosen different blocks and they've all put them together differently. And so therefore, they're going to create a different edifice, a different building. That's what's going on here. So Zionism needs symbols also. So for example, this is actually a modern symbol, the Congress. Why was it called a Congress? You know who went to the first Zionist Congress? Whoever could afford a ticket, they got to go to there was no election of delegates, but they called it a Congress, and it was black tie, not optional, black tie required, because who has Congresses? Nations have Congresses. So that the whole thing was a game in this way. The flag. Why was the flag like this? So here you have one idea for the flag. Star of David, which we know from Gershom Shalom is actually only a couple hundred years old, is a Jewish symbol, but never mind. Don't ask questions in a story. Why are there 7 stars around it? That was the 7-hour workday. It was the socialists were promising an 8-hour workday. So the Zionists are going to beat it by an hour and have a 7-hour workday. If you ever see the film, Something About Mary, there's a scene where the guy picks up a crazy hitchhiker who has an idea for a video. Instead of a 7-minute ad, he's going to have the 6-minute ad. Because if you're at the store and you're going to buy a video, what are you going to buy? The 7-minute ad with the 6-minute ad when they're right next to each other. You're going to buy the 6-minute ad. So the Zionists had the same idea, a 7-hour day instead of an 8-hour day. It's too complicated. They eventually went with the flag that you know, of course. Why this flag? Because the blue stripes evokes the Talit, right? Clearly, the Star of David. These are Jewish symbols. And by the way, it worked. I'll tell you a story, another Ma'aseh Shahaya, in the city of Sans, a city that was so religious that a memoir of the city said the least religious man in the entire city was a dude who wore only a black hat and had a fur shtreimel on Shabbat. That's how religious this place was. Anyway, the Zionists eventually come, as they always do, and they hang up a Star of David, inviting people to a Hanukkah party. I'll get to that in a second. When the rabbi sees the Star of David, he calls an emergency meeting at Shul, and he says to the men, rip the Star of David's off your talis bags, rip it off the parochas, off the aron where the Torah is being held. It is metame gevorn. It has been defiled because the Zionists have claimed it. It's now a Zionist symbol. And he was right. It had, right? I mean, I'm not saying it was tame, it was impure, but he was right that it had been appropriated. That he was right about. Texts. So they're going to choose texts and liturgy very selectively and with radically new interpretations. How many of you have heard from Israeli friends and family or Zionists, next year in Jerusalem, we say on Passover, at the end of the Seder. Next year in Jerusalem, we say on Yom Kippur, at the end of the service. But you could be in Jerusalem. You're a hypocrite. You could go right now. El Al will take you one way for free. You have to fly El Al, but you can go one way for free, right? But that's not what the verse ever meant. The verse was a call for Messiah. It was never an actual, let's hope to move to Jerusalem, but they reinterpreted it in this way. Rituals, right? You have the Karen Kayemet box. Everyone knows the little blue box. It was deliberately chosen to mimic the charity box, the pushka of Rebbe Meir Baal HaNes. In fact, the Zionists said, on women, on Friday nights, give a coin, give tzedakah to the Karen Kayemet box when you light Shabbos candles. It wasn't about the money. Now, I know my grandfather of blessed memory used to always tell me, whenever somebody says, it's not the money, it's the principle, it's the money. However, in this case, it really was also the principle. What they wanted to do is to sort of elevate the ritual of giving money to Zionism as a mitzvah, as a commandment, to make it part of your Judaism. They used to also, in Hasidic places in Galicia, on your Erev Yom Kippur, there's a custom by Hasidim to put out plates for tzedakah. Everyone would have and specifically a plate, because it said when the coin hits the plate, that clank breaks the bad gezeras, the bad decrees that you might have had stuck on you for the coming year. I'm not asking you to believe, that's just a Hasidic custom. So they said we put out plates for the Zionist movement because we wanted it to be elevated in this way. They have Jewish holidays, but not any of them. You can't really work with Rosh Hashanah very well, Yom Kippur, but Hanukkah, that was big. Hanukkah was, and not the candles. And the Zionists were explicit about this. Forget the candles. They said they couldn't, they were so excited. Some of these young Zionists I studied, when they finally kicked out the rabbi and took control of the Hanukkah festival, they were thrilled because they got away from the candles to talk about the Maccabees, the military campaign, right? This becomes elevated as the most important holiday of this form of Judaism. And history, right? Selectively choosing history, Masada, Bar Kokhba rebellions. These things become huge, and there were never Jewish holidays or things to be celebrated. On the contrary, they were pushed down by classical rabbis. The whole concept, you ever heard the joke, Jewish history from Tanakh to Palmach, right? From the Bible to modern Israel. The idea is everything in between is irrelevant. That's what's important, the Bible and today. Everything else, forget about it. Other key symbols, reinterpreted. Land of Israel, right? It's not about the land the way Judaism for 2,000 years imagined it, which was this mythical place that we kind of know is on earth, but don't really, and we want to go there by doing more commandments. No, it's an actual place. It's got sand and it's got resources that we can build on and so on, right? That's the idea. So they're taking the land of Israel and reusing it and how its role in their Jewishness. Bible is very important. Talmud, not so much. Within the Bible, Book of Joshua, that's great. Conquest of the land of Israel. Isaiah, we could do without Isaiah. And how about a Messiah? You got to have a Messiah if you're talking about Israel, the land of Israel. The Messiah hasn't come, unfortunately, but are you sure he hasn't come? Maybe he has, because there he is, right? Theodore Herzl, look at him. I often joke, and in my defense, I've heard Derek Penslar make the same joke. If he was clean shaven, would there be in Israel today? I'm not so sure. Because look at him, right? He's Jewish, powerful, almost like a prophet, looking with his powerful eyes, so charismatic, so charismatic. When he came and he nurtured this idea. So if I may read you a quote from an early Zionist Congress of one attendee, he writes the following: "This is no longer the elegant Dr. Herzl of Vienna. It's a royal descendant of David, arisen from the grave, a descendant of David means Messiah, arisen from the grave, who appears before us in the grandeur and beauty with which legend has surrounded him. Everyone is gripped as if an historical miracle had occurred. And indeed, was it not a miracle that took place here? For 15 minutes, the hall shook with the enthusiastic cries of stormy rejoicing, applause, and the waving of pennants. The 2,000-year dream of our people seemed to be approaching fulfillment. It was as if the Messiah, son of David, stood before us. A powerful desire seized me to shout through this tempestuous sea of joy, Yechia Melech, long live the king." Check out, if I can get this to advance. Check out, no, not yet. This is the delegate card from the 5th Zionist Congress. Take a look at this. Here you have Herzl with all the modern bourgeois men and women, right, from Central Europe. And here you have ancient peoples from the set of 10 commandments, right? And here's Charlton Heston. Instead of holding a shotgun, he's got his staff, right? And he is handing it over to Herzl. The message is quite clear. Just as Moses brought those Israelites out of diaspora into the land, so too will our Moses, Herzl, do the same. This is not subtle. Men don't do well with subtle. This is a 2x4 across the face, right? This is Messiah. This is King David, all rolled up into one. Now, they're not just going to take the Jews out of diaspora. They are going to take the diaspora out of the Jew. They are going to remake the Jew from his body up. The body is key, right? So we have the co-founder of the Zionist organization, Max Nordau, who is obsessed with making Jews of muscles, right? This is what he wrote at the Second Zionist Congress. For history is our witness. We must think of creating once again a Jews of muscles. For history is our witness that such a Jewry had once existed. Once upon a time, we were engaged in physical things, but now we've been oppressed and shoved into ghettos and dark alleys and so on. But now, he writes, all coercion has become a memory of the past. Let us take up our oldest traditions. No, not studying the Torah, not praying, not davening, not doing mitzvot. What's our oldest traditions? Let us once more become deep-chested, sturdy, sharp-eyed men. And that's what they intended to glorify. Here comes the naked pictures of Herzl. So, for example, the Jewish gymnastic movement. It wasn't a coincidence that the gymnastic movements, all of the national groups in Europe had gymnastic movements. There was the Turnervereine, there was the Sokol movement, all of them had it in Central and Eastern Europe. And the Jews had theirs as well, called the Maccabees, of course, typically, or Bar Kokhba. The new Jew's gonna walk over Palestine, no problem, right? He's so strong, he's just gonna walk right over it. And what does the new Jew look like? Well, check him out, man. He's ripped, right? Check out those muscles. I work out now. Let me just say, my wife got me for a present. I see a workout guy twice a week. I'm seeing him tomorrow. He's killing me. And I've been doing it for months. And I don't look anything like this, but I'm trying. But check him out. We got the arms, we got the legs. Look at that butt. I mean, this guy is ripped, and look at his face. That is Theodore Herzl, right? That's what we imagine our hero must look like naked. This is by a artist called E.M. Lillian from Drohobych in Galicia, and he made a whole Bible, and every character was Herzl, right? Here's Herzl as the angels guarding the Garden of Eden. He's got, again, the massive muscles. He's wearing a thong. It goes halfway down his leg, and then just on top of that, you got this sort of Freudian sword that goes down to his feet. This is a real man, right? Here he is again as the angels. Here he is as Aaron. Here he is as Moses, as Joshua. This is the new Jew, right? And not just him. Here's a propaganda piece from early 20th century American Zionism. When you give to Zionism, look what you're giving. Like, look at this guy. He's Jewish. He's kind of not exactly white, but dark, but white. He's got hair. I know I'm biased, but man, look at that hair. He's holding, I don't know. I'm from Chicago. I think is it a hoe? Something. I don't know, but he knows what it is. And he's farming with it, right? Because he's the new Jew. He's going to farm. And look at them here. They're the two of them. He's got, what do you call it? A sickle or something. And she's spreading the seeds and they're so happy. That's what you're giving to, right? The new Jew. And of course, the new Jew is going to be militant. He's going to fight. That's why, by the way, in the Holocaust remembrance for years, the only Holocaust worth remembering is the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising. That's why Holocaust Remembrance Day is the day it is. It's the day the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising broke out, because they were real Jews, right? Avinoam Pat just published a book on remembrance of the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising, and this is a part of it. The way Zionists appropriate it is very, very important. The new Jew. Now, if I showed you this picture, and I've done this experiment before, I won't waste your time with it, but if I said to you, out of context, what political party produced this picture, right, of a massive Superman naked, heaving a flag up a mountain with hundreds or thousands of naked, faceless men, all raising their arm in salute to him? I am quite confident most of you would tell me it's a fascist program, but it's not. It's Zionist. It's specifically the revisionist movement, which takes over a lot of the fascist aesthetic, but it's part of this new Jew that's being created. What about religion? It exists. They have these, right? But minimally and for certain sectors that we'll talk about in a bit. Now, what was the religious response to this movement? Well, the vast majority of Jews opposed it. It was one of the only things, if not the only thing, that pretty much all Jews, almost all Jews could agree upon, right? In the West, both Orthodox and Reform Jews opposed it as heresy, right? Which it was in a sense, from a traditional Jewish perspective, it was heresy, but also because it was opposing the trend of integration. For 100 years, Western Jews have been screaming, our nationality is local. We're German, English, American, French, Italian, whatever. And the Zionists come along and say, no, you're not actually. It's not your nationality. You don't belong here. They were scared and they were appalled. The first Congress was supposed to have been in Munich, but local rabbis protested and got it pushed out to Basel, Switzerland. In Eastern Europe, Orthodoxy, which was most of Eastern Europe eventually, was basically defined by its anti-Zionism, and for multiple good reasons, by the way, from their perspective. The movement was inherently secular, no doubt about that, that's for sure. It was, they said, halakhically forbidden to force God's hand, right? You want to move to Israel? Okay, do more mitzvot, study more Torah. That's what you need to do to get to Israel. That's the deal. But also, they were concerned about the way Zionism was replacing Torah identity. That guy I told you about on the plane, right? Or my roommate at Hebrew University who told me I don't have to keep kosher Shabbat because I serve in the IDF, right? That's his Jewish identity. They saw that and they were concerned about that. This is, for example, not the Satmar Rebbe. This is before there was a Satmar Rebbe. This is the 5th Rebbe of Lubavitch. And he says quite clearly that the Zionist glory in the name of Israel applies purely to the name of Israel, which to them constitutes Judaism. But from true Judaism, which is the fulfillment of the Torah and the commandments, and faith in the Lord and his holy servants, they are completely distant from through the Zionist ideal. May Hashem Yisbarach frustrate their counsel. Now, there were, as you know, a couple efforts to square the circle, to bring together Orthodox Judaism, as it were, and Zionism. These are sort of representing the two camps that did so. You have on the one hand, and I keep hiding this thing from you guys, you can see what I'm looking at. On the one hand, you have Yitzchak Reines, who founded the Mizrahi movement. On the other hand, Rabbi Avram Yitzchak HaKohen Kook. And they have a problem because most Orthodoxy said Zionism is heretical. You can't force God's hand. So how do they answer it? Well, the earlier, more important one was Rhinus, was the Mizrahi movement. I'm not going to read the whole quote, but essentially he says, this is not about Messiah. We're just getting the hell out of Dodge. You know the expression. We're getting out of Europe. It's burning down, man. We got to get out of here. Which is why in 1903, when the Uganda proposal came to the World Zionist Organization, and Herzl said, I think we should look into Uganda, Mizrahi, the Rhinus camp, they said, we vote yay. Let's look into Uganda, because it wasn't about Messiah. It wasn't about Palestine. It was about getting out of Europe. So they voted for Uganda. On the other hand, you have Cook, and he says, as many of you know, my screen sharing is paused. No, I don't want to pause. How do I unpause? Resume share. Sorry about that. It was paused for a moment. Cook says, are you kidding? Not about Messiah. Of course it's about Messiah. You think you're going to move people because we need to get out of a dangerous place? That's not going to move people. You need to have the idea that a holy people, unique among nations, the lion cub of Judah, is stirring from its long slumber, returning to its inheritance, to the pride of Jacob whom he loved. That will move people. You don't think we're about the Messiah? You bet your ass we're about the Messiah. We're 100% realizing messianic redemption, and his son took it even farther. Not just the land of Israel is holy and the people of Israel is holy, the state of Israel is divine. The state of Israel itself is divine. So when this camp opposes any sort of withdrawal from territories conquered by the state, it's not just about distrusting Palestinians or Arabs or whatever it is. It's about rolling back the redemption of the entire universe, because we are the center of the universe. Jews are the center of the universe in this system, and Jews expanding and settling and building up this country, that's bringing Messiah. We are bringing Messiah. So you're hurting everybody by pushing the Jews to get out of these places. That's the idea here. Obviously a lot more to say about this, but I'm just going through very briefly. Look at that, I'm perfectly on time. Some conclusions. I can't believe I'm on time. First of all, the Messianic dream. Yes, it is an axiom of rabbinic Judaism. No doubt, no doubt, no doubt. The land of Israel, part of the Jewish myth symbol complex, 100%. And other texts and traditions defending Zionism, these are real building blocks, like the parable I gave you of the 4-year-old who knocked down the palace of blocks, right? The 8-year-old who had to rebuild her thing, she's taking real blocks. Those are real blocks. That's a text. That's a tradition. That's a whatever. These are real things, right? But nationalism itself is a very modern ideology built on certain key modern inventions, the printing, the rise of mass circulation newspapers, so that people all over Jews all over the world were reading about each other, secularization, the idea of the modern nation, lots of things, right? There's a reason why it took Zionists so many decades to convince Jews to imagine themselves as a modern nation, because it was so modern and new. But they were doing it based on these previous blocks, picked selectively, put together selectively. That's what they're doing. So in other words, Zionisms, and there's more than one, Zionisms are modern forms of Judaism. Like the other modern forms, Orthodox and the various kinds of Orthodox and conservative and reform, et cetera, et cetera. And some of these unite with different Zionisms over the decades in new permutations all the time, right? Zionism is a modern ideology appropriating pre-modern symbols and constructing its own worldview, and of course, inventing new ones, right? Yom HaAtzmaut, the story of Tel Chai and Trumpeldor, the Jewish hero who died defending the kibbutz, and his final words allegedly were, "It's good to die for your country, for your land," right? Or for that matter, the song Mi Malel, which I'm going to pause my screen for a moment. So if you don't know the words to Mi Malel, right? You know the Hanukkah song, right? Mi Malel Gerot Yisrael. You know the song I had to learn when I was a kid. So look at the words to it for a moment. If you haven't ever done so, look at the words, right? Who can, from this site, Israel Forever Foundation, which I absolutely love, right? That captures so much of what I'm getting at. Who can retell the things that befell us? Who can count them in every age? A hero or sage came to our aid. Hark in this time of year and days of yore, Maccabees and temple did restore. It's actually a good translation. And tonight our people as we dream will arise, unite, and be redeemed. You know, it's not very easy to translate in rhyme. That's actually a pretty good job. But you see, this is a pun off of Psalms. And in Psalms, it's God will come to our aid in every age. But now in this version, we come to our own salvation, or rather our heroes will save us, right? No God saving us. We'll save ourselves. This is a modern, very religious song, but secular religious song, right? It's secular, but it's this sort of new secular religious that I'm trying to describe. So essentially, Zionism, like, and this is the last point I have here, like all modern forms of Judaism, it will claim to be the most or even the only authentic expression of Judaism. So just as Orthodoxy will say Reform Judaism, that's not even Judaism. Are those people even Jews? I'm not even so sure, right? And Reform, it goes both ways. I was raised conservative, and when I was growing up, Ismar Shorsh was the chancellor of JTS. Some of you know him or know who he is. He came to my synagogue in Chicago, a flagship conservative synagogue, and he gave a lecture that was literally called "Why Conservative Judaism is the Authentic Form of Judaism," right? We are authentic, you guys are fakes. You're not real. That's not Judaism, right? And that's what Zionism does. When Zionism say, if you don't believe in us, you're not really doing Judaism. That's what's going on here. It's the same phenomenon. And from my perspective, I think whatever your reaction is to an Orthodox Jew saying to a Reform Jew, you're not doing Judaism, you're fake, you're not really Jewish. That should be your reaction when a Zionist says to an anti-Zionist or non-Zionist, or vice versa, you're not really doing Judaism. Now, if you want to say the way you're doing Judaism, you have to keep it to yourself and not hurt other people, that's a different story. But in terms of your own Judaism, if you say what you're doing is not Jewish, that's the same thing. So that's, I think, when we want to understand how Natan Sharansky and Gil Troy are calling people un-Jews, or how people are saying, how someone could say, you're a Zionist? Oh, well, then you're not really a Jew, because that's not Judaism. Or you're an anti-Zionist? Oh, well, then you're not really a Jew. Then you're against Judaism. That's what's going on here. They're defining Judaism in this particular way. They've chosen these building blocks and made this edifice. And they're saying, if you don't do that, you're not Jewish. And that's the same exact thing. It truly is the same thing that we should be aware about. And that's why I tell people, and I'll end at this point, I got an email recently that asked me, what about the fact that some Jews, their Zionism, when they hear anti-Zionism, they feel it as an attack. That's what's going on, right? They don't actually know much about Israel-Palestine, maybe. But when they hear anti-Zionism, they're not hearing about Palestinian lives. They're hearing that their Jewishness is somehow not real. And that's again, what's going on here, because that is their Jewishness. All right, there's lots more to say, but I'll stop here and open it up to questions, and I'll stop my share. And should be a way to grid this thing. Let's see here. View gallery. Excellent. There we are. Okay. Sydney, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Professor Shanes. So again, if people have questions, they should type them to me in the chat. I haven't gotten any yet, so I'll wait for people to compose some. But I have some.
I've had some questions, but they went to me, Sydney, not to you. Oh, they all went to me.
Okay. Okay. Well, you might have to. Well, then you're in the position of having to choose them.
I guess I'm in the position. I guess I'll do it by the order they came in. I'm going to read them out loud without not reading them first, so I hope I don't get into trouble. Galicia. I thought that it consisted of Western Ukraine and Eastern Poland. My father's parents are from Galicia, Chernovitz, and the other from near Ternopil. And I thought Galicians were not really respected. Galicia, not our topic at hand, but I'm never going to turn down a question on Galicia. Galicia is the piece of Poland that was in the big division of Poland in the late 1700s, taken by the Austrian Empire. A little bit of it is today in Poland. It's around Krakow. That's the westernmost part. The district's around Krakow. And then over the San River into what's today Ukraine, as far east as Kolomea, Brody on the border with Russia, and a few other cities out there. Chernovitz is in Bukovina, which is, it's sort of Galicia. It's not technically Galicia, but it's sort of Galicia. They're not respected. It's ridiculous. There's the long history of why they're not respected. and there's many jokes I could tell you about that, but it's bogus. Any of you are from Galician, be proud. I'm not Galician. I can be this honestly. I'm from Eastern Ukraine, and my mother's German. The Galicianers produced the leading Zionists, the leading Hasidic rabbis, the leading rabbis, and leading secular thinkers, historians, writers. Agnon, for God's sake, was from Buchach, and so many. All of the Jewish historians of interwar Poland were all Galicianers. So be proud if you come from Galician stock. All right, that's not our thing at hand, but I had to answer it. Read the parody of Zionists as fascists. The fact is that most Jews now are proud of our vigorous male and female IDF soldiers, not in a fascist way. Yeah, the thing about fascism, that was my sense of trying to show you there is a wide spectrum of Zionisms, and they are all drawing on Jewish past and drawing on contemporary world. And revisionist nationalisms that's drawing especially on fascism was part of that, but not the only part. There are certainly clearly there are many, many non-fascist parts as well. I just thought that was kind of cool. Apologies if this is too much of a digression. Do you have any thoughts about how to use some of these insights to intervene in ongoing conversations about when anti-Zionism is and isn't anti-Semitic? Oh my God, yes. I have so many thoughts on that. I am going to limit them because otherwise I'm gonna have you here for breakfast. So first of all, if we understand Zionism separately, both together with what Israel is doing in practice, but also separately from that, that will help us. So if we're having a conversation about Zionism, about what it's doing in Israel, then we can talk about what Israel is doing, right? And then you have people who could say, I favor that, right? I think for whatever reasons, or I'm really troubled by that for whatever reasons. And you can have that conversation. That is separate from a Jew in diaspora, or in Israel, I suppose, who says, my Jewishness is my Zionism, right? If that's your Jewishness, that's great, until the point where you are trying to impose yourself on somebody else, whether it's in Israel oppressing someone who's not Jewish, or if it's in America trying to shut down speech you don't like. There we can say, well, I'm sorry, you don't like this, but my identity, just as your identity is Zionist, mine is anti-Zionist, whether coming from Jewish sources, like, I don't know, 1800 years of sources that all of the rabbis traditionally drew on that were against this because it's heretical, or whether it's because I'm a modern liberal Jew and I think Zionism can't be separated from what Israel's doing, I'm against what Israel's doing, and so my Judaism is going to be something else, right? So it has to go both ways. So if we understand this as denomination, we can have a sense of conversation that is respectful, but allows all these perspectives to air without unjewing anybody. To my mind, in terms of anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism, to my mind, this is the model I like to use. It's not perfect. I'm sure some of you out there could poke holes and show me where the flaws are, and I accept that. But as a oversimplification, if your statement about Zionism, Zionists, or Israel is a conspiracy theory about global power, that is anti-Semitism. If you could pop out, if you talk about Zionist, Zionism, or Israel, and you could pop out the word Zionism or Israel and pop in the word Rothschild or Soros, that is anti-Semitism. However, if the anti-Zionism is simply a critique about Israel, even if it's wrong, and even if it's unfair, and even if it's really focused on Israel when the Uyghurs are being murdered by China, that's not anti-Semitism, right? Because that's talking about what a state is actually doing. If you're talking about what a state is actually doing or what you think it's doing, that's talking about a state. If you're talking about a global conspiracy theory, then you have anti-Semitism. I'm sure you could find holes with that and exceptions, but I think that's useful as a beginning point in any event. Eric,
Professor Shanes.
Yes.
Oh, sorry.
Sure.
Somebody sent a question to me, so I'll read it, and then if you want, I'll go back to you. So the question is, I agree that Zionism was a 19th century European national movement, but to what degree was it shaped by anti-Semitism?
So that's a great question. I don't want to exaggerate and say there was no role to anti-Semitism. Certainly there was. Zionism Certainly the role of the pogroms famously, right, had a role in shaping anti-Semitism. For many anti-Semites, for many Zionists, I mean, I especially, so I mentioned to you before Gideon Shimoni, the scholar of Zionism. He divides Zionists, broadly speaking, the leaders, into two camps. And I see this myself in the work I've done. One camp he called modernizing ethnicists. These are people who grew up in a very Jewy milieu, probably spoke Yiddish, were religious, and they come to Zionism because they're leaving what we would call orthodoxy, and they're looking for a kind of modern Jewishness that is authentic feeling, modern, and Jewy all at once, and they come to Zionism that way. Then there are groups that he calls disillusioned integrationists, people who had hoped to become part of other national movements, but experienced rejection for whatever reason, like Herzl most famously, and they become Zionists out of that frustration. For the latter group, guys like Herzl, anti-Semitism is very important. For the former group, the modernizing ethnicists, anti-Semitism is not especially important. So it just depends on who. So I don't want to say it's not important. I want to say that the standard narrative, the one certainly that I grew up on in the 80s, and the one that I still hear in my kids' schools, I think overstates the role of anti-Semitism. And by the way, and certainly post-Holocaust, there's a whole industry, a whole ethos of what one scholar calls Holocaustia, right? An obsession with the Holocaust to justify and animate Zionism today. So that's also, it's actually much more important today than it was 100 years ago in that sense. But I think in general, Zionists do themselves a disservice by focusing too much on that, because Zionism in many ways is coming out of Judaism, right? It's one of the paths out of Judaism, just like Orthodoxy and Reform are paths to Judaism. And I think that by overemphasizing anti-Semitism, it underplays the building blocks they actually choose. I've been emphasizing to you that they're choosing selectively and rebuilding them in new ways, but they're still doing it, right? They're still taking those building blocks. And I think that putting anti-Semitism in its place, frankly, does a service to Zionism in my eyes. But in any event, that's the history as I see it. Eric, I think, had his hand up. Can he be unmuted? I don't know who's, can I unmute him? I don't know what I can do. Where is Eric?
I can do it. I'm asking. Yeah, there he's unmuted now.
Oh, Eric, you're on.
Okay, you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
I wanted to relate a bit of family history. My parents, the legend is, they met at an Emma Goldman lecture here in Toronto.
Mm-hmm.
They kept kosher all their lives, were 3-day-a-year Jews, but it corresponded very much to the kinds of history you were talking about. You know, that the idea that they would, you know, that the place to meet would be at an Emma Goldman lecture.
Or in this case, a Josh Shane's one. By the way, if any of you guys become matches at this thing, I get $500. $500 per match. If any of you guys start dating and it works out, I get $500. I'm just saying it now, claiming it now. Thanks. There was a question that popped up here. Hang on. For Reconstructionist Jews, excellent. This is a Reconstructionist show after all. Kaplan emphasized that the more aspects of Judaism we could absorb and grow with, the richer our Jewish identity. I like your story about the building blocks. It reminds me of Kaplan's approach. I feel that we miss so much that we deny others their Jewish identity. One group can't deny the legitimacy of another to a good end. Yes, talk about building bridges. It could be that I've read everybody. I'm not everybody, but I've read a lot, like most of you have. So maybe Kaplan dug his way in my brain and he's in there, and I didn't quite realize it more than that. So it's very possible. I think in terms of building bridges, I would just repeat again, my version of pluralism. This came up today in Facebook, actually. I'm gonna reiterate a point that I made today, so I think it's important. There's a famous conundrum that faced Orthodox Jews in Germany in the 19th century. And the conundrum goes like this. Traditionally, if any Jew is Machal Shabbos for Hesia, if someone is breaking Sabbath publicly, they are out. They're heretics of one category or another. Can't count them in a minyan, can't marry them, et cetera, et cetera. What do you do in Germany when 80% of the Jews are the deviants? I mean, really, you're the deviant, right? What are you supposed to do then? So there are two possibilities. One of them was Raphael Hirsch's. He said nothing's changed. They're breaking Shabbos publicly. They're throwing off the yoke of the halacha. They're out, right? They're not Jews in good standing. No minyan counting, no marriage. They're not in my community. They're out. Another guy came along named Ettlinger, and others followed him and said, look, man, I mean, maybe the first generation, but since then, you know, it's like from the book of Jonah. They don't know the left hand from the right. They're idiots. He says they're tinik shenishpa. They're like children captured by barbarians. They know nothing about Judaism. So how can you blame them? You can't blame them. It's all accidental. Therefore, you can absolutely embrace them as fellow Jews and hug them and love them and count them for a minyan and marry them and so on. But the problem is with that approach, doesn't that sound nice? But what's he doing, right? He's disrespecting. I mean, he's talking about your rabbi, right? He's talking about all of you. He's talking about educated adults who have studied, who are smart, who have come to the decision to live Jewishly this way. And he's telling you, you're an idiot. If you knew better, you'd be like me, right? So what are you supposed to do? Those are your two options, right? Either you respect a person enough to expel them, or you disrespect them to love them. And Rabbi Sachs, the former chief rabbi of England who just passed away, he writes about this in one of his books. He says, yeah, that's the problem. I choose disrespect. I love you people. You're my fellow Jews, but you're an idiot. You don't know what you're doing. And that's my solution. But I think there's a better way from my perspective. And the better way from my perspective is humility. The better way is to say, we don't know really which were the blocks we were supposed to keep. And of the ones we were supposed to keep, we don't really know exactly how to build them. And we're all trying, we're groping. We're just groping, right? Reconstructionists, you're groping. Orthodox, I'm not Orthodox anymore, sort of, but they're groping, and conservatives groping, and reform, everyone's groping, and Zionists are groping, all the different kinds of Zionists are groping. We don't know what, when we die, if there's a God, he'll tell us. But until then, reminds me of this, there's this great South Park episode. It's this really raunchy cartoon, if any of you know it, it's hysterical. And everyone died, they're in hell. And they show a scene from hell, and there's a guy who gets behind the microphone, like at a camp, like in the Catskills. Welcome everyone, welcome, yes. Well, there's 8,240 of you. Welcome to hell. And one guy says, wait a minute, I was a good Protestant. Why am I in hell? And he says, oh, well, I'm sorry, you were wrong. He said, wait a minute, I was a good Jehovah's Witness. No, I'm sorry, you were wrong too. He said, well, who was right? Oh, the answer is the Mormons. The Mormons was the right answer. And the rest of you are in hell. I'm sorry. It's hysterical. But that's the idea, right? When we die, we'll find out. But until then, we don't know. So if we have an attitude towards Jewishness that says, look, man, I studied Jewish texts and Jewish traditions, and I have my own ethics too about humanism and morality and particularism and Jewishness. And I have all this smushed together. And to me, it seems like, well, you guys have chosen this and paid your dues, I'm guessing. Reconstructionism, right? And you're hoping when after 120, you're not down there where the guy will tell you, nope, sorry, it was conservative Judaism. You got it wrong. No, you're hoping that you get it right? So, you do, and I'm choosing what I'm choosing, and you hope, and you should pray where it seems right. But if you have just a little space in your head to think to yourself, I might be wrong, right? I might be wrong. It could be that the conservatives are right. It could be that the Orthodox are right. It could be that the Hasidim are right. I can't be sure. And if you have that space, it seems to me that that's how you have bridges, right? And the same is true of Zionism and anti-Zionism. If you're an anti-Zionist, you could say, this is wrong. Jews this is wrong because the Messiah hasn't come. This is wrong because in a pre-Messianic world, the only way Jews can make a state is by oppressing Palestinians in terrible ways, and I'm against that. Or you could say, oh, the texts are clear. Jews are a nation. We should have a state. After the Holocaust, it's clear we have to have a state. And whatever it is, right? You have your views. But if you have a space in the back of your head that says, maybe I'm wrong, it seems to me then you get away from the conundrum. I can both respect you and include you. I don't have to choose. That's sort of my spiel on that. I'm sure it has flaws like every other one, but I think that's the way out. I think that's the way out. And if we understand Zionism as we would understand Orthodoxy and Reform and Reconstructionism, then it works. If we understand Zionism as being above that, as being somehow untouchable, then you're screwed. Then you're screwed. You have no way out, right? And that's why I think it's so important to understand it that way. It shouldn't be that I can walk into almost any synagogue, including many Orthodox synagogues, and loudly declare to people who are schmoozing with me, talking during prayer, of course, because we're Jews, and I say, you know what? I don't really believe in God. I don't. I'm here because I like it. I like the Shmuel tearing. It's a good Kiddush, but I don't believe in God. Nobody would care. I'd probably still get an Aliyah. I'd probably to get an Aliyah, right? Oh, this guy doesn't believe in God. Give him an Aliyah. He needs to be, he needs some cheering up, right? But if I walked into most shuls and I said, God is very important to me, and I study every day. I'm actually doing Daf Yomi, and I go to shul every day, and I keep kosher very strictly. Matter of fact, I'm actually a vegetarian because I think it's wrong the way the meat industry works, whatever. But I'm against Zion. I'm an anti-Zionist, actually. I think the way Zionism is not working, is happening, is just wrong. Jews really can't do this before the Messiah comes because it causes them to become oppressive. I would be shown the exit. And if I wasn't shown the exit, I would certainly be not very popular at Kiddush, right? I would be sitting on my own, eating, if I would be lucky to get a piece of herring. And that shows you, I think, that Zionism has become a kind of mantra or thing that is above everything else. And that to me is crazy. So yeah, I think this gets us out of that conundrum. Other questions? I ate dinner already, so I'm good. I can keep going if you like.
Josh, I'm gonna sort of ask a question which plays on, I think, what you just said, but nevertheless, just maybe to sharpen it. So there's sort of related two questions that are sort of related. So one is, if Zionism has, as you argue, legitimately become a type of Jewish religion, it's been absorbed into various religious streams, and it is its own religious stream for people who don't have any other
Yes.
form of Jewish religion. Are people who say anti-Zionists are oppressing my religion? It's religious discrimination to attack Israel or to cry Zionism. Do they have a point? You hear that argument a lot in the Jewish community, that the Jewish students are subject to anti-Semitism merely by the fact that people are making anti-Zionist arguments and saying Israel is terrible and you're a terrible, if you support Israel, you're terrible, and that's viewed as religious discrimination. So it seems to me that there's something to that argument, given what you've said.
It depends. It depends. I would say the following. I mean, at some level, if you follow that through, it means you can't be a Jew on campus because you're insulting Christians who believe that Christ is our savior. And you can't be a Christian on campus because you're insulting Jews who reject Christ, right? So we have to have space for all these religious expressions on campus as long as they don't suppress everyone else. We also have to be careful to separate my faith and my identity as a Zionist or whatever with talking about what the state of Israel is doing, right? We have to be able to talk about that, to defend Israel, if that's what you want to do, or to criticize Israel, if that's what you want to do. So I would say you have to look at the cases. I think mostly, speaking as an academic, I noticed that the times that this works out best is when all of the national Jewish organizations just butt out and allow the students to figure it out. This happened in Iowa a year or two ago, and it was wonderful. There was such a discussion that you raised, and there was conflict, and no Hillel got involved, and no federation, no ADL, and no anything. And they worked it out. I wouldn't have written the resolution quite the way they did, but it was decent, right? And it was wonderful. I think that if a Jew is being asked, because they're Jewish, when they run for student government or try to take a seat, what's your position on Israel because you're a Jew? That's unacceptable, right? Or because you're a Jew, you have to denounce Israel. That's unacceptable. However, the idea that having an apartheid week where Palestinians want to say, what's happening in the West Bank is apartheid and we object to it, you don't have to agree with them, but that's not anti-Semitic. How can it be? That's impossible to call that anti-Semitic because then you can't defend Palestinian rights. So I think it depends on how you exactly are doing it. I think that's the issue. Are Jews being conflated with Israel, or is Israel being criticized? In a multicultural society, you're going to encounter religions that tell you your religion is wrong. Most religions tell you that the other religions are wrong, right? I mean, what, Christian church can't have a big cross on it because it traumatizes me as a Jew? Kind of does, but tough shit. I mean, that's, sorry for my language, I'm a bit like tough, right? There's going to be crosses out there. I'm sorry, there are. Even though I reject Christ, there's going to be crosses. It seems to me that's the same situation. As long as the police, no one's coming to me and saying, if you don't accept Christ, you can't take your seat in student government. Then we have a problem. That would be my answer to you.
Okay. I see that Marty Klein has his hand up, so I think you have the permission to unmute him. You can do that.
Oh yeah, where is he? Oh, there he is. Asked to unmute. I think.
I'm unmuted.
Excellent, Marty. Good to meet you.
I'm curious. I'm a historian, and though I work on Africa, I started out in European history, and I was fascinated by the nationalist, by the whole ripple effect of Herder throughout Eastern Europe. And I've always seen Zionism in this context. I'm also, I come from a family, my father was a Zionist, my one grandfather was Workman's Circle, the other one was Orthodox.
Oh my God, a mixed marriage.
That's, where do we get into the next two generations? And I'm a passionate person, and I don't dislike people I disagree with. I'm just passionate, and what bothers me most about this debate that's going on now, particularly on the campuses, is that it's not that people disagree with me, but they challenge my legitimacy, and some of my friends challenge the legitimacy. I have a granddaughter who's made Aliyah, and she didn't ask my opinion. And she's in the Air Force. She's taken it all. She's not political. She's not religious. She just likes Israel, and because she's planning to live there, she's doing her military service. She's a what do they call it? A lone ranger or a lone
soldier.
Lone soldier. And when she came to visit, I said, "Why?" And she said, "Explain." I said, "Okay." That's what I find difficult to understand, and it also comes down to this thing in the States where people don't go to Thanksgiving dinners because they disagree with Uncle Herbert. My nuclear family, that's ruling out the other extremes. We have 4 different religious options and 4 people.
Only 4 with 4? I thought usually with 4 Jews. I thought with 4 Jews you have 6 opinions.
No, on Israel there is no 2 opinions.
I see.
The other side challenges my legitimacy and they insult me over and over again.
Oh, that's not. In what sense do they intend your legitimacy, and what do you mean by that? Can I ask?
Well, nobody's accused me recently of being a self-hating Jew.
Oh, you haven't lived then. I don't go a week without that one.
Oh, I like myself. I'm 88 years old, and I've had a pretty. I don't know that I'll make it that far.
In gesund, with gesund.
But the all of these people who are making these extreme opinions, they have brothers, they have cousins. The Zionist movement doesn't come out of nowhere. And people don't sit down with their family and say, "Shall we become Zionists?" Theodore becomes a Zionist. Does he have a brother? And I think we have to respect each other. And I will shout and scream and argue very passionately, but we're family.
Mm-hmm.
And for me, family is not just other Jews. It's not just blood relatives. It's people I've related to, and my father, who was what's the world of our fathers, it's a little bit like what you're saying. At the end, he says, what happens to the kids? Well, my father's one of the kids. His father was Workman's Circle, and he was a Zionist. And you're describing my father.
Well, that's kind of cool. I'll tell you, there's a great book that I strongly recommend called Trouble in the Tribe by a head of Israel studies at UCLA named Dov Waxman, who I happen to like a lot as a person too. He's written several books on Israel, but the one I like to assign to my students is called Trouble in the Tribe. You can get it online cheap because you use copies now. And what he shows, it's about how in America, and he means also Canada today, and he means North American Jewry. Everyone's like this trouble in the tribe. We're fighting with each other. We can't agree on Israel, right? Different organizations. And what he points out is that's actually the norm over the last 100 years. He says there was a blip from the 6-Day War into the mid 80s, not even the mid 80s, early 80s. There was a blip where most Jews in North America basically had the same view about Zionism in Israel. He said, but before then and since then, we have not. And that's normal. And I think that's some comfort to know that this is the norm. Arguing about Israel and Zionism, that's the norm. The axiom that we have to believe X, Y, or Z, that's not normal. That was a weird thing because, the emotions of the 6-Day War, the times, the duration, the distance from the Holocaust, et cetera, that led to a certain period for 10 or 15 years. But otherwise, this is what we do. Like you said, we argue about what it is. But if we do it with some humility, and that's hard for me, maybe it's hard for some of you, but if we can get that, maybe we'll be able to keep the respect you were talking about, and or Uncle Herb can stay with us for Thanksgiving, as you put it.
Okay. I see that Diane Klein.
Yes, please, Diane.
Can you unmute her?
Oh, I can do it. Ask time. I think
I can do it. I suppose.
Oh, I'm sorry. I think I just muted it. By there we go.
Okay.
Hey, Diane.
All right. No relation. I see there are multiple clients. I just want to say quickly, I've been in an event that I won't describe in detail, but it reflects all day many of these sentiments. And I guess I just made a note of Dov Waxman's book, which I will get and read. And I would say what's painful to me in the current environment is that some of these fights are resulting in Jews attempting to deprive other Jews of their livelihood over it. Right? It isn't just who comes to Thanksgiving or not. It's people calling for this program, that program to be canceled, this donor, that donor to withdraw their funds, this person, that person to be stripped of tenure and driven out of their chosen profession. And that's very painful to me. And so it's anything that's an opportunity to create more thoughtful, compassionate dialogue across these differences, I think is important. And I think it's important for the Jewish community as it presents itself to the non-Jewish world. I mean, even if, as you say, and I have no doubt is the case, these kinds of conflicts have long been with us, and if there was consensus, that was an exception, not the rule.
Yeah, no, I agree. I mean, I'm not. My own personal view. I think we have to have, in general, keep that dialogue open. I don't want anyone losing their tenure for their opinions, no matter what. And I have been on the record defending people who I thought had not only odious opinions, but were, pardon my French, assholes. And I've defended them because they were tenured. And there's a point of that. There's a broader protection of advancing ideas. That's very, very important. I would say personally, there's a great book called The Conflict Over the Conflict. It was written by Ken Stern. He's a guy you might have heard of. He wrote the IHRA definition of anti-Semitism. And he wrote it for data collection and then got very upset when people started using it to legislate against free speech. And he started writing articles saying, that's not why I wrote this. It's not the purpose of it. And so he wrote this book, The Conflict Over the Conflict, to say that the solution to hate, and he runs a hate studies institute, the first one in the country, as a matter of fact, at Bard College in New York. And he said the solution is free speech. You got to let everybody talk. And you know Ken Stern, yeah. And I think that's very important. And for those of you who don't know the book, I recommend it. It's quite good, called The Conflict Over the Conflict. The first chapter actually is an introduction to hate studies. It taught me all about the field. I knew nothing about that field, and it was quite instructive. And then he talks about, he has 2 chapters where he says, here's a bunch of people trying to shout down Zionists, and that's wrong. And then he has 2 chapters saying, here's a bunch of Zionists trying to shout down anti-Zionists, and that's wrong. We have to have dialogue. You have to let everyone talk on campus. People are going to be, and this goes back to Sydney's question, people are going to be bothered. They're going to be upset, and that's too bad. That's part of what it's all about. You're going to get upset sometimes. You're going to hear things you don't like. You can walk away, but things are going to be said that you don't like. And that's the price we pay. And that's a good price to pay, because the alternative is much worse. So, and I think I agree with that approach for the most part, very, very much. There was a question in the chat box, and anyone who wants to raise their hand, you're welcome to. There was a question in the chat box. Is there an anti-Zionist Jewish organization to counteract AIPAC? Because their opponents, because they always attack them for making statements critical of Israel's treatment of the Palestinians. Well, there's a lot of organizations. Hell yeah, I mean, all sorts. There's, for example, it's not anti-Zionist, it's explicitly Zionist. No problem, Diane. It's explicitly Zionist, but the Trua organization run by Rabbi Jill Jacobs of the conservative movement is a wonderful group that advocates for Palestinian rights from a Zionist perspective. You have further to the left, of course, there are anti-Zionist groups, the most famous being JVP, right? The Jewish Voice for Peace. I think, Sydney, you're involved with them, right? Or maybe it wasn't you. I personally am not a fan of JVP, although my brother-in-law is a national leader in the group. So Thanksgiving is always a treat at our house. But I think that but we have Thanksgiving together, and I'm going to his wedding in 2 months, so it's all good. But anyway, I think that JVP occasionally dips into that conspiracy thinking about Israel in ways that concern me, but they are certainly anti-Zionist and are focused on Palestinian rights. And there's lots of other organizations around them. There seems to be increasingly, I think, a polarization going on. You've all seen it, you all know it. But there are options, lots of options out there. But AIPAC's interesting, right? Because that's another thing. It used to be that AIPAC presented itself as being the national bipartisan, blah, blah, blah. And it's not really anymore. I don't think people really outside the bubble think it is. It's a partisan group now. And there are other ones that are equally tend to be partisan. J Street is moderate, but it tends to be Democratic, right? That's the way it is. There really is no one single big tent organization. Although AIPAC is by far the largest gathering of Jews in the country each year in America, by far. So take that for what you want. Other questions?
Okay, Josh, if there aren't, I mean, if there are, we can have them, but if not, it's also 9 o'clock, which is sort of where we said we were going to.
Yeah, you want to give Fred LaBrief the last question?
Sure, yeah, we got time for one more question.
Yeah,
sure.
Last question, please. I'd love to hear it. Oh, you have to unmute. There you go. Oh, she was unmuted briefly. Try one more time. I'm going to ask to unmute. There we go. You got it.
All right, thank you.
Sure.
It's a simple question, actually. I would just like you to write down the names and the authors of the books you recommended.
Oh, sure. And I can recommend many, many, many more. If you have,
Those two.
So one was Dov, I'll put it right now, Dov Waxman, Trouble in the Tribe, which is about the politics of Israel in America. And it's a very, very fine book. And he's a great author. And I would recommend anything he writes, actually. And the other one is Kenneth Stern, who again is the author. By the way, I should say, it's called The Conflict Over the Conflict, is the name of the book. And I should say, I like Ken a lot. I think he's terrific. In fact, I'm going to be on a panel with him soon at a conference in Israel. I am not a fan of the IHR definition of anti-Semitism. There are fine people, including Ken, who like it. I prefer the Jerusalem Declaration on anti-Semitism personally. So I would recommend to everyone, if anti-Semitism is something you're interested in, to look up these definitions. They're very short. They're a page. You can do it over your morning coffee. You can read the IHRA definition and read the JDA. And you can also look up articles of advocates of each one in the popular press. I've written an article, for example, defending JDA in Slate magazine. I think JDA is better. I think the IRA one lends itself, because it's so vague, lends itself to suppressing speech. And I think the JDA does a better job of avoiding that, personally. But there are very fine people who advocate for each one. I don't want to besmirch them.
Thank you.
I know I just realized I just repeated the Trump line of very fine people, but in this case, I really meant it.
He probably meant it too.
Yeah, fair enough.
Okay, well, if there are no more questions,
yeah.
we hit 9 o'clock exactly, which is always
Perfect.
a good thing. Always keep them begging for more. You know, maybe there's one more question which we won't let them ask. So I just want to thank you, Josh, for this. I found it interesting and enlightening talk, and I hope other people did too. And you know, we had a nice turnout. So thank you, everybody, and good night.
Thank you all for coming, guys. Take care.